All right, good evening. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar tonight on the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework. This is a webinar on what we've heard so far. We're excited to be sharing with you this evening. Just a few housekeeping items. First of all, letting you know that the meeting is being recorded. And also all questions should go through the Q&A feature on the Zoom. And in the latter half of the webinar, there will be a time where we will be going through and answering all of the questions. So thanks again for joining us. And I'm going to hand it off to Erican from the Office of Planning.
Thanks, Molly, and welcome everyone to our presentation tonight on the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework. So we have some slides to present, and then as Molly mentioned, we'll have some Q&A at the end. So our program for tonight is first start with some introductions of our team here at the Office of Planning and our consultants who are assisting on this project. And then we will provide an overview of the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework and a timeline of the project, especially for folks who may be joining us for the first time. And we'll provide an overview of sort of what we've been hearing so far through our engagement activities over the summer and early fall. And then kind of finish off with our upcoming events and next steps in the project. We'll be holding two in-person community events coming up on November 19th and December 3rd. And so this presentation is a bit of a tee up for those two events coming up. As Molly mentioned, any questions, please do enter them into the Q&A feature here in the Zoom. And as she mentioned, also this meeting is being recorded, and we'll be posting the video and this presentation to the project webpage afterwards as well. So first, just some quick intros of us here. So my name is Erican Osberg. I'm the project manager at the DC Office of Planning, focusing on the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework project. And we'll go down the list here of folks who are on the call as well. And not sure if Heather's with us tonight. Heather, are you here? Looks like maybe no, so I'll pass it down to Jonathan next.
Thank you, Erican. I am Jonathan Green. I am also with the neighborhood planning section of OP, and I am supporting this project with Erican. And I will pass it to Meryl.
Hi, everyone. Meryl St. Ledger. I'm with Smith Group. I lead the urban design and planning studio here. We are the lead on the consultant team. Nick?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Martinazzi. I'm with Smith Group as well, and I'm the project manager for this piece. Pass it on to Roadside and Harwell.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Sessoms. I'm an urban designer with the firm Roadside Harwell, and we're leading the landscape architectural and public realm design components of the plan.
With Brick and Story, we are a local community engagement firm, and we are supporting the consultant team and the Office of Planning on all of the engagement around this project.
We also have a few other groups that are joining this team but aren't on the call tonight, HRNA and NAccess, who are respectively working on commercial and residential and retail market analysis. This group, you'll be seeing more of us at our community meetings coming up, and for folks who have been out at some of the events on Wisconsin Avenue over the last few months have definitely met Jonathan and I on the community walks or at Open Streets just past Saturday. And so if there's some familiar faces out there, hello, folks. So first, we'll give a bit of a background on this planning effort as it focuses on Wisconsin Avenue. And so this is an area of the city that we refer to as Rock Creek West. And really the focus of this project is to implement changes that were made to this district's comprehensive plan as part of the amendment process that was adopted by council last year in 2021. And there were new land use designations that were adopted along the corridor, and along with some policies in the comprehensive plan that really envision greater residential development along the corridor, particularly at the Friendship Heights and Tenleytown AU metro stations, to increase opportunities for new housing and affordable housing in this part of the city. There's a similar planning effort occurring along Connecticut Avenue in parallel to this one on Wisconsin. And on Connecticut, the focus is Cleveland Park and Woodley Park metro stations. And so the same team that you're seeing tonight is working on both projects with a similar timeline. So in addition to our comprehensive plan, which is our guiding document for managing growth in the district, there's a few other studies and reports that are guiding what we're doing here on Wisconsin Avenue. In particular, the mayor's 2019 Housing Equity Report, which sets affordable housing goals for different planning areas across the city. And in particular, in the Rock Creek West area, nearly 2,000 affordable housing units in this part of the city. And in addition to the Housing Equity Report, the Rock Creek West Roadmap, which was published last year, outlines the district government's interrelated financial and land use policy tools to help produce and preserve this affordable housing. And so laying out a bit of a roadmap on how to achieve this relatively ambitious goal for seeing more affordable housing built in this part of the city. And really, the impetus behind these goals were to look at where affordable housing existed across the city and where it existed the least or most, and calibrate those goals to try to create more equitable distribution of affordable housing in all parts of the district. And as you can see on this table on this slide, while financial subsidies support the largest share of where we expect to create and preserve affordable housing in this part of the city, land use regulations and large opportunity sites along major corridors also play an important role in producing affordable housing. So that's really important in this part of the study area. And so just coming back to the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework, as I mentioned, the goal really is to implement the comprehensive plan here where land use designations have been updated. And there are four interrelated goals of the project. The first is to really support increased housing opportunities, particularly affordable housing, and with a focus on urban design, which is why a lot of our consultant team has a design focus. So we're really looking at how new buildings and bigger buildings would fit into the corridor moving forward. The second goal is to coordinate with future transit investments that are being led by our partner agencies like DDOT and WMATA. So that's the Tenleytown Multimodal Access Project right behind the Whole Foods by Jackson Reed High School, which is kicking off this year, as well as the Western Bus Garage Redevelopment Project being led by WMATA, where they're looking to move and expand the bus garage up around Friendship Heights. The third goal is to assess the market dynamics along this evolving corridor, really to explore the realities and expectations for what kind of commercial, retail, and cultural uses could and should exist here in support of new housing. And the fourth is to create a public realm plan to support new mixed-use development, which we expect to have more housing. So what are the spaces between these buildings like, and who are they for, and how do they become more safe, welcoming, and inviting for a range of new people? And so sort of tracking on to the goals of the study are sort of the three components, the outputs that we're working on. The first is what we're calling a commercial action strategy. And that's really rooted in a market study to understand sort of the non-housing aspects of the corridor, particularly, as I mentioned, like retail and office space and cultural and entertainment uses. Particularly as we understand sort of consumer spending behavior is changing, and we expect the land use pattern on the corridor will change as well. And as I mentioned, a public realm plan, really honing in on prioritizing sort of key public space needs in order to coordinate a vision along the corridor that connects spaces and people between buildings. And third, a zoning study, which will be making recommendations to change zoning along the corridor that incorporates greater proportions and depths of affordable housing, a mix of unit sizes, and urban design considerations that maximize height and density permitted in the comprehensive plan. And so this, the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework is building on other recent projects and studies that our office and partner agencies have been working on. As I mentioned, there's the Rock Creek West Roadmap from last year, but also many folks may remember or participated in the Friendship Heights ULI TAP. That was the Urban Land Institute's technical advisory panel from last year, which produced a report exploring some new opportunities for Friendship Heights, given the retail transition that is occurring there with many closures of big box and department store retail there. And as I mentioned, also the project is being developed in coordination with DDOT's Townleytown Multimodal Access Project and WMATA's Western Bus Garage development. Our office also coordinates with partner agencies engaged in citywide planning efforts, including the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education and also the Department of Parks and Recreation. And so in terms of the project timeline and milestones, we kicked things off this past summer with 2 community walks and an online survey. And then during the summer and fall, our team was out in the community at pop-up events, and we're doing targeted outreach with specific groups now who may be less represented at some of these activities. And so at this point in the process, we're reporting out on things that we've heard so far in advance of in-person design conversations that we have coming up, where we'll be exploring development scenarios along the corridor, particularly at the Friendship Heights and Townleytown metro stations. Looking ahead, the study is expected to culminate with a draft report for public review in the early winter of 2023 and a final report in the spring of 2023. So what have we been up to and what have we been hearing? So since our first community walk in Townleytown in July, we've had a strong and growing participation from the community up and down the corridor. We've had about 130 folks come out to the 2 walks that we held this summer. And we've had over 700 views of an online version of that walking route, which was available for folks who maybe weren't able to come out to those events. And we've also had about 1,200 participants of an online survey that was open for 6 weeks between July and early September. And our team has also really benefited from all the public events that have been happening on Wisconsin Avenue over the last few months, including the 2 Makers Market and Street Festival events held by Friendship Heights Alliance and the Bastille Day celebration held by Townleytown Main Street. And of course, we were out at the Open Streets event last weekend and talked to lots of people there too at that well-attended event. What we're finding is that our pop-up events and online surveys give us the ability to connect with a broader range of residents who may usually come out to a scheduled public meeting. And so this is part of our strategy to try to connect with a lot of different people in a lot of different ways to make sure we're talking to as many different voices and perspectives as possible. Before we get into some of what we've been hearing so far, I just also wanted to direct everyone to the project webpage, which is publicinput.com/RCW-Wisconsin. And this is the digital home base for the project. Here you can sign up to receive email notifications, register for upcoming events and activities, and also review any completed materials. There's a couple of tabs at the top of the webpage, and here's a screenshot of the webpage. And so the resources tab at the top is where you can find documents like the reports and studies I mentioned earlier. You can download those and read them. We actually just posted an existing conditions report for the corridor last week, so there's some new content there. And also under the past events tab, you can see a summary of all the public engagement activities that we've been participating in, like those public meetings I mentioned earlier. And there we'll also be posting this presentation and the video from tonight as well. So in the next few slides, I'll be diving a little more into the responses and feedback we've received through our online survey and some of our focus group discussions as well. But we've kind of summarized some of the general sentiment that we've heard also during our community walks and pop-ups, which is echoed through some of the comments that we were submitted through the survey and conversations as well. And so there's sort of these 5 kind of categories, thinking about folks' future hopes for the corridor and as a thriving and more connected place that is attractive and attainable to a diverse mix of residents and businesses, both existing and new. One of the other themes was around streetscapes and public spaces that are safe and inviting for all users, especially people walking and biking, families, and also older residents who use the corridor a lot as well. Housing is a big topic, and we've heard a lot about the housing needs and considerations that increase options in terms of unit sizes, so 1, 2, and 3 or more bedroom units, more dedicated affordable housing, and also the ability to age in place. We've heard a lot about retail and the businesses along the corridor and the desire for more neighborhood serving retail that supports and includes more local businesses, restaurants, and spaces to meet and gather, and at a range of price points for folks at different incomes. And finally, we've heard about sort of development in general and the desire for more mixed use development that incorporates things like green features, sustainability, includes a lot of housing over ground floor retail, and also can elevate the existing positive attributes of the corridor's buildings and public spaces. I should also mention that the Wisconsin Avenue itself has come up a lot in conversations, both as a challenge and opportunity. And while specific transportation changes to the street itself are outside the scope of our study here, this is feedback that we're hearing and we'll be incorporating into our final report. So when we get the next 10 or 12 slides really cover an overview of what we've been hearing from our survey. And as I mentioned earlier, the survey was open from July 27th through September 11th this year and was accessed by over 1,200 individuals. And really this was to help us gather big picture ideas that will help shape the community design conversations that we have coming up for the Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework. The survey featured 30 questions, mostly were multiple choice, and about half of those questions were requesting self-identifying information so we could get a little bit of a sense of who we were hearing from. We also received 3,600 written comments to 7 questions that had a free response option as well. And as we're going through the survey responses, we understand that respondents to surveys like these are sort of self-selecting individuals who are connected to the internet and are technologically proficient to engage in that kind of activity. And so the survey responses aren't or shouldn't be considered as statistically representative groups, but we do think it's a really important way for us to gather input and share it back as well. I should also mention that an interactive report of the survey is also accessible on the project webpage under the past events tab I mentioned before. And so just in terms of, as I mentioned, who we're hearing from who we heard from in the survey, when we compared it to our local demographics from the American Community Survey and also our citywide demographics, survey respondents who did provide self-identifying information tended to skew a little bit older, so over 50, and we had an underrepresentation of Black or African American, Asian, or folks who represented as 2 or more races. And we also had an overrepresentation of homeowners versus renters. So that was something we were looking at as we were understanding what we heard from in the survey. So one of the early questions in the survey was asking folks to sort of describe the area both now and in the future. And so, in terms of these 2 word clouds kind of give an overview of some of the most commonly shared responses to those 2 questions. And so, folks describe the area today as having potential, had a lot of traffic with lots of restaurants and businesses, and in the future as hopefully being more affordable, vibrant, and have a lot of housing and retail as well. Since housing is the focus of our effort here, we asked how could new housing development positively impact the community? And this was how all folks who responded to the survey shared. And one of the most important sort of things that people flagged was for more customers in the area to support retail and entertainment options. We also noted that greater socioeconomic diversity was also an important response here. For some of the questions, we broke it down between sort of homeowners and renters, where we noticed there may be some differences in how those individuals responded to some of these questions, particularly around housing, because that sometimes relates to how people understand housing in their neighborhood. And so in this instance, we asked sort of how it's the same question and a bit of a difference in response. Again, sort of the homeowners see the value of new housing as adding customers to support retail, whereas renters were interested in more diversity in household incomes and age diversity of residents potentially in those housing options. We also asked about affordable housing and what kind of affordable housing was most needed. And so we asked this question to cover both size of housing, but also tenure or maybe who it might be targeted towards. And all respondents indicated that 1 to 2 bedroom units were the highest, but also larger units were also desired here as well. Ownership and condominium was also another sort of highly responded answer on this question. When we break, again, sort of looking at the breakdown between homeowners and renters, we see that for homeowners, and this includes folks who may be living in multifamily buildings as well and condominiums, there's a desire for larger units on the corridor and also just a greater diversity of homeownership options. And renters were really interested in affordable housing units that may be a little bit smaller or moderately sized. We had, the survey was open to anyone, whether they lived or worked on the corridor or not. And so we wanted to understand who we were hearing from in that regard as well. And so in terms of current residents responding to this question of sort of housing factors that are concerns, what we heard was that a lack of adequate amenities, so things in the neighborhood like playgrounds or senior services and retail were sort of the top of the list. We also asked sort of housing factors or concerns that may influence people's ability to stay in the neighborhood. We understand that some folks are being priced out or they feel like the neighborhood might not work for them long term. And so we want to understand what are, get into that question a little bit more. And so for folks who are homeowners in the neighborhood today, sort of again, tracking onto a similar question from before, amenities are important for them to be able to stay in the neighborhood. And for renters, they're seeing housing costs as being a major barrier to staying long term. We also recognize that this part of the city isn't always as accessible as others for folks. And so for people who don't necessarily live in the neighborhood now, we asked also about some housing factors. And so in terms of what housing factors would make the neighborhood attractive to them to maybe move here, it was interesting that proximity to housing and other amenities and services was an important draw. And as far as housing factors or concerns that may inhibit folks' ability to access housing here, the price of home sales was one of the highest, and of course, rent being high as well. We are also interested in asking folks about how they're using spaces along the corridor, both private and public open spaces. There's a range of types of spaces in the up and down Wisconsin Avenue. And so we wanted to get a sense of how these are being used. And, I think Fort Reno being a large and sort of even a regional amenity came to the top of the list here. But also the trail and park at Grover Archbold and the Chevy Chase Recreation Center were also important amenities for the community. We're also asking a little bit about spaces along the street. And so outdoor dining came to the top of the list as how folks would like to use public space more in the neighborhood, but also just sort of strolling, walking around, enjoying the neighborhood on foot. And when asked about what kinds of amenities folk would like to see in public spaces, I think a need for green elements like trees and plantings also came to the top of the list here. We were also asked some questions about businesses and services and retail. And so full service restaurants were identified as a business or service folks would visit more often if it was located along the corridor in greater number. Similarly, cafes and coffee shops, as well as books, music, and hobby stores. So again, mentioned earlier, the desire for more places for people to meet and gather, and these are businesses and service types that fit that description. Also, arts and entertainment, movie theaters, something folks would sort of like to see or feel is missing. Of course, the movie theater in Friendship Heights closed recently, but also outdoor public art and cultural institutions or performing arts were other types of things that folks would like to see on the corridor. I know when I was at the Open Streets event on Saturday, a lot of folks were talking about live music and things that they used to or would like to enjoy again along the corridor. And these are some examples of places where people who live and work along the corridor visit today nearby. And then we were also asking folks about buildings and architecture and design and the kinds of buildings and places in the neighborhood that they felt some connection to or really liked. And here's an example of some that really stood out from some of the responses that we received. So things like the Tenley Friendship Library, the former Fannie Mae building, which is now part of the City Ridge development, 4101 Albemarle, which is the residential building on top of the retail with Target and the hardware store, AU's Law School, which is along the corridor, St. Anne's Catholic Church, and then sort of I think some of the newer developments down at City Ridge as well, behind that former Fannie Mae building. We also received some comments that from folks who indicated that none of the buildings necessarily stood out, but we wanted to include some here that folks really did like as well. And I would note that all of these kind of skew more towards publicly accessible buildings and institutional buildings, as well as some of the more recent mixed use developments on the corridor. Relatedly, we asked about some good examples of developments that folks thought creatively combined existing and new buildings in DC neighborhoods across the city or also in other cities. And so there's been a lot of development happening across the district over the last 20 years, and there's been a lot of examples that folks could draw from. Here are some that rose to the top in terms of responses we got. Down in Shaw, some of the new buildings around the Atlantic Plumbing Complex. This one's at 901 W Street. The Liz Apartments on 14th Street, which includes the Walter Whitman Clinic. The new sort of Trader Joe's building at Eastern Market, which is called 700 Penn. Many of the various developments around the Capitol Riverfront. This one is called the Eris, and this is one of the also old industrial buildings. But also outside of the district, folks identified Bethesda, Maryland, just up the road, as having some good examples of new buildings that integrated with old, and even further afield in places like the Short North Arts District in Columbus, Ohio. So shifting gears a little bit from our online survey to what we've been hearing in our focus groups. As I mentioned before, in addition to some of our in-person community walks and conversations at pop-ups and the online survey, we are also doing more targeted outreach two specific groups. We wanted to make sure there was space for different perspectives to convene in smaller groups and have more of a dialogue specifically around challenges and opportunities to creating housing along Wisconsin Avenue, particularly affordable housing, and actually not just in Wisconsin Avenue, but in the Rock Creek West planning area in general. And so we've held a few focus groups so far with community organizations and advocacy groups who work in the affordable housing space in Ward 3, developers who've had experience or own property in Rock Creek West, and also with residential service providers that operate citywide, often in projects with income restricted housing. So this slide and the next summarize what was shared during some of those conversations. Community groups in Ward 3 really emphasize the need for creating affordable housing across all income levels, household sizes, and housing types. This group highlighted that there should be a concerted effort to increase affordable housing near transit, particularly for those at the extremely low income brackets. And also offer opportunities for community groups to form partnerships with developers to ensure that projects are delivering on community priorities. In terms of some of the developers that we spoke to in the focus group, a number of challenges to developing mixed use projects in this part of the city were shared, such as restrictions on zoning, height and density. In certain areas, there may be historic preservation requirements that become a challenge. And also making space for sort of that retail at the ground floor and pick up and drop off and adequate parking around some of these new developments. This group outlined a number of opportunities such as increased density, which can support affordable housing for developers and offsetting the land acquisition costs of some of these properties, and emphasizing that not all of the housing priorities can necessarily be placed on one project. And so thinking about multiple projects as contributing to achieving our housing goals along the corridor and in Rock Creek West. And we also spoke with some resident-focused organizations and service providers. And so these are individuals that work in nonprofits or groups that operate in housing that is usually income restricted, providing services and management of those kinds of buildings. It was an interesting conversation. Some of what we heard was that both clients and staff of these organizations found that affordable housing was not necessarily something that might be attainable in Ward 3 at present. And from their experience, voucher holders and low-income residents can sometimes be stigmatized by neighbors based on false assumptions. There was definitely a sense that leveraging faith-based organizations and other mission-minded groups could help to educate the community on the importance of affordable housing and who it's for. And a sense that Ward 3 has been somewhat shielded from growth and development happening in other parts of the district, although an acknowledgement that that's changing right now through grassroots efforts in the community and also through our policies in the district government. And finally, just the need for financial support for nonprofits to develop and manage and maintain affordable housing in Ward 3. So that's our overview of sort of what we've been hearing so far, particularly from our online survey and from some of our focus groups. And so I wanted to bring us back to the project schedule, just as a reminder of sort of where we are in this process tonight, as far as reporting out on sort of these things that we've heard so far in advance of our in-person design conversations coming up this month and in December, where we'll be exploring development scenarios along the corridor. And so, moving forward, the engagement to date and these upcoming meetings will be informing our draft report that will be issued in the winter, and which is also an opportunity for additional feedback at that time prior to our final report being developed in the spring. I did also want to mention that, as part of our targeted outreach, we accept any invitation to speak with a community group or resident group along the corridor or join any public event that's happening. And so we do our best to accept all those invitations. Over the past few months, we've been fortunate to be able to present at the Advisory Neighborhood Commission. We've met with Tenleytown Main Streets Design Committee, the Friendship Heights Alliance Board, and groups like Ward 3 Housing Justice Working Group and the Washington Interfaith Network. So if folks who are tuned in tonight or hear this presentation later, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to join a meeting or do a presentation for a resident group or community group. So I just wanted to also mention our upcoming community design conversations, and talk a little bit about what to expect at those. So these are 2 in-person events in an open house format. The first is in Tenleytown coming up on Saturday, November 19th from 11 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. And it will be at St. Columba's Episcopal Church at 4201 Albemarle Street. And the second is in Friendship Heights on Saturday, December 3rd from 10:30 to 1:30. And it's in the Lost Origins pop-up gallery, which is a retail space in the Chevy Chase Pavilion, which is accessible from the first floor. And that space is also on the first floor, whether you're coming in from Western or from Wisconsin Avenue. And the address there is 5335 Wisconsin Ave. And in these events, as I mentioned, they're somewhat of an open house format. So any point during that 3-hour period, feel free to drop by for as long or as little as you like. And we're going to have a lot of information presented on boards, as well as some more focused conversations around tables to talk about those development scenarios and some of the designs that our consultant team is working on. For anyone who may have joined one of the events we recently had in Woodley Park or Cleveland Park, the format's very similar. And the focus will be in and around Tenleytown at the first meeting and in and around Friendship Heights at the second meeting. And again, this is a bit of a recap of our next steps. Our 2 meetings coming up November 19th and December 3rd. Following those 2 meetings, we'll be posting the boards from those meetings to the project webpage for feedback, which will be in an online survey format. And then in the winter and spring, we'll have our draft and final reports ready. And again, just wanted to highlight our project webpage, publicinput.com/RCW-Wisconsin. And my contact info is on there. So if you want to email the team, feel free to reach out on the project webpage. So that's it for our presentation tonight. And I think we're going to shift over to some Q&A right now as well.
Jim, please send it through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will be answering questions in the order that we've received them. So our first question is from Mike Bush, and his question is, does DC's Office of Planning have a formal relationship with Montgomery County, for example, to discuss moving the WMATA bus garage to the Geico parking lot instead of to the Lord and Taylor?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mike. Yes, we have been, we coordinate on a pretty regular basis with Montgomery County, particularly in Friendship Heights right now, but also in other parts, in like Silver Spring, for example. And as far as your question about WMATA's bus garage, presently WMATA has made an offer and is negotiating with the property owner of the former Lord and Taylor site. So that is a decision that is more firmly with WMATA than either Montgomery County or the District of Columbia. But we are coordinating together because WMATA also has part of their bus loop is on the Maryland side of Western Wisconsin as well. And so, and the Friendship Heights Metro Station extends on both sides of the district and state line.
Great. Our next question is from Ann Schwartz. She's asking, can you share what groups you're reaching out to deliberately because they might not have been represented in other activities? I think that was partially answered, Erica, but maybe if you want to give a little bit more detail there.
Sure. And feel free to fill in, Molly, if I'm missing anything. But so we have a few upcoming other focus groups that we're scheduling right now. One is with some of the younger adult residents on the corridor and folks who may have young families, recognizing that it's sometimes more difficult for them to come to our meetings given their sort of busy schedules. As I mentioned before, from our survey data, our respondents skewed a little bit older, so that was an area where we wanted to be a little bit more intentional. Also, business operators, business owners. Our approach there is to actually go visit them in person, recognizing that they often don't have the time or capacity to come to a meeting or even tune into a webinar like this or come to an event. Often at events they're working too, so trying to find downtimes, for example, after Thanksgiving, when we may be able to visit them and speak to them directly.
Yeah, and I'll also add there, in addition to the focus groups that were mentioned that have happened, we've also done some targeted outreach, tabling specifically in multifamily buildings to try to have some brief conversations with residents as they come in and out to hear their perspective. And we also are having a conversation with homeowners, specifically homeowners of color, as they also were underrepresented in the survey results.
Yeah, thanks, Molly.
Next question is from Carol. How can focus on urban design increase affordable housing?
Thanks, Carol. So I think the answer to that question is the focus on affordable housing is, and well, housing in general and affordable housing is our policy orientation. And in order to achieve that, we have to figure out where and how more and new buildings will fit on the corridor. And so the policy direction that we're implementing is to effectively figure out where more building volume and capacity will go on the corridor. But we want to be thoughtful and intentional about that and also build on the existing strengths of the neighborhood and ensure that we have neighborhoods that will be successful and thriving in the future. And so the focus on design is about not whether we're going to be adding more housing and affordable housing, but how we're doing that and where it's happening along the corridor. And so I hope that answers your question. And if anyone else from our design team wants to chime in on that too, I'd be happy to hear from them as well.
Well, I just wanted to add that good urban design creates the types of places that are welcoming, vibrant, connected, and that really supports how we do mixed use development, including housing. And when new housing is developed, obviously a percentage of that is required to be affordable. And so while it doesn't create the affordable housing, it certainly supports it.
Great. The next question, we've spoken a little bit to this, but we'll read it. And if there's anything additional to add, this is from Jerusha. There's a significant concern among the community to the proposed Western Bus Depot relocation to the Lord and Taylor site. The question here is, has WMATA purchased the Lord and Taylor site, and are they going to be required to provide concrete plans before moving forward?
So yeah, thanks. Good question. A lot of conversation around WMATA and the Lord and Taylor site and the bus garage in Friendship Heights. So to my knowledge, WMATA has not yet purchased the Lord and Taylor site. They were authorized by their board in the summer to pursue acquisition of that site, and they are in the process of pursuing acquisition of that site. But to my knowledge, they haven't closed or there has been no formal announcement on whether the site has been purchased. WMATA, as a federally regulated agency, has a series of requirements they have to meet when they're doing any kind of project like this. And so they will be developing plans and doing a series of environmental and other assessments on the property prior to building anything. And that is a process that they would be starting following their acquisition of that property. And so WMATA was at the Advisory Neighborhood Commission meeting in September, talking a little bit about their process. and they would be holding a series of public meetings and have a public process around that site as it was designed and developed moving forward. I will say we are, as part of our process, modeling what that garage might how it might fit into the neighborhood, and how other kinds of development might be able to fit on top of it or next to it as well, to create more of a mixed use environment there. So that's something that we're going to be looking at as part of our process. And actually, we're working with WMATA. They'll be coming to our meeting on December 3rd in Friendship Heights to speak to that a little bit as well.
I think she's trying to ask why are we focused only on rental opportunities and apartments? Maybe this is an opportunity for some clarification as well.
Sure. Thanks, Holly, for the question. So we're not only focused on rental opportunities in apartments. We are expecting all the new housing on the corridor to be multifamily housing. So that's like multi-level housing in larger buildings with elevators for the most part. And they could be rental or they could be condominium. There isn't a way for the district to mandate that. That happens as a result of the property owner deciding sort of how they want to pursue a project based on market conditions and their financing. There's different requirements for rental versus ownership. But we do expect all the new housing to be multi-floor, multi-family buildings. And we're expecting most of those buildings would also be mixed use. So they'd have some other non-housing element on the ground floor, like retail or some other uses.
Next question is from Carol. She's asking, to get more diverse perspectives, has there been any outreach to people who live in other parts of the city who might like to move to the area along Wisconsin Avenue?
Yeah, thanks, Carol, for that question. So in two ways. One, on this, as I mentioned before, the survey was open to anyone in the city and we asked specifically about zip code and some of the questions were targeted towards residents or folks who specifically weren't residents of the area, for us to get an understanding of their perspectives about this project. So that was one area where we were able to hear from folks who lived elsewhere. And then the other avenue was through our focus group on with service providers in residential buildings, which were predominantly income restricted buildings or affordable housing. And most of those were actually in other parts of the city or in multiple parts of the city. And we were talking to those folks who both work with residents and who have staff at those buildings to try to get at some of these questions about perceptions of being able to move to this part of the city and sort of expectations about what that might look like as well. So those are two ways, but if there's other ways that you would suggest, please feel free to email us and let us know. We're happy to try to explore those opportunities too.
I'll add also there, Erican, that our outreach to businesses is also thinking about possibly, people who work in the corridor or visit the corridor frequently, who might be interested in moving to it, but currently unable to or haven't. So that's just one other way that we're trying to create really an inclusive process of hearing voices of not just residents who live in Ward 3, but also people who may be interested in moving there. Next question is from Holly. What weight do you give to public input in making design decisions and plans?
Thanks, Holly. Well, we have to, it's really important for us to hear from the community when we're thinking about design. We have to balance that with sort of what we know and expect to be feasible in terms of construction or whether something's buildable or not. But certainly, we want to be able to reflect in what we're designing, the things that we're hearing that folks want to see and would support in their neighborhood. And so it's a really important part of our process, not just for design, but also for some of the policy decisions which affect design, but also affect sort of the broader community development along the corridor. And I'll also, since it's a design question, if Meryl or Ron have anything to add there, particularly around our buildings and public spaces. Our public spaces are really important to get public input on.
I think that's exactly why we do, studies of scenarios, and that's why we're going to be looking at the, a few selected opportunity sites, both in Friendship Heights and in Tenley. And so we were asking for people to take a look at the scenarios that we're building, give us feedback on design elements, and that's really the chance to help shape what the design and the development could look like in the future in those areas.
I think that's right, Meryl. I agree. Even thinking about the presentation that Erican just shared with us, where we were able to see what types of amenities residents are looking to have along the corridor, et cetera. It really helps us to understand what the opportunities are, and we can develop a plan around those opportunities as we move forward. So public engagement is very important to us as we begin to formulate ideas and share those ideas with each of you, and to get feedback and continue to refine those thoughts as we move forward.
Yeah, thanks. Design is an iterative process. And so, starting with our walks in the summer and the survey and our pop-ups and these kinds of questions are all really helpful for us as we continue to plan and design sort of our process, but also the products that come out of it.
Sorry, Susan, if we're getting this wrong, please type it again, but I believe you're asking if there is any city-owned land that can be developed for affordable housing.
So on the Wisconsin Avenue corridor, there's the only city-owned land are the schools and some of the parklands. And then some of the parklands are also federally owned, and the library, I should mention as well, the Tenley Friendship Library. And so there, the schools, particularly in Tenley Town, Janney, Jackson Reed, are very full and busy, and recently also been expanded. The library, when it was built about 10 years ago, was built to potentially accommodate some overbuild on top of it in the future. And so there may be an opportunity to sort of revisit that investment that was made at that time in terms of whether some housing and affordable housing could be built there. But there's very little city-owned land along the corridor. But there are some federal properties as well as some institutional land that could particularly some of the faith-based institutions that maybe sort of as part of their mission be interested in specifically developing affordable housing.
Great. Roger is asking if we could please discuss height restrictions.
Sure. Thanks, Roger. So I think at our upcoming public meetings, we'll have a much more information on sort of what the various heights that are permitted in different parts of the corridor are per the comprehensive plan. And because there's differences based on different blocks and how the underlying policies apply there. But as part of those changes to the comprehensive plan, the heights and densities on many of the properties were increased. In terms of what could be permissible. As just for folks to be aware of, in the District of Columbia, we have a congressionally mandated height restriction, which is called the Height of Buildings Act, which regulates all buildings in the district and how tall they have to be. And the maximum height along, for example, Wisconsin Avenue couldn't be more than 130 feet. And that would really only be in a couple of places. And so just wanted to share that, but we'll definitely be showing what the heights and densities could be in our upcoming community design conversation meetings.
pursuing a small area plan in the future after the development framework final report, or is that still TBD?
Thanks, Patrick. No, there is not a small area plan that will be developed here in the future. The Wisconsin Avenue Development Framework is the planning study that was recommended by the comprehensive plan and budgeted for by council for this fiscal year. And so following this study, there will be a series of recommendations made around public space, but also for changes in zoning, which would then result in zoning changes that the Office of Planning would present to the Zoning Commission for the corridor along the study area. And that would be next calendar year.
To what extent or how are you incorporating or addressing the World Health Organization's age-friendly communities or livable communities guidelines?
So thanks, David. So those specific guidelines are not part of what we're addressing in our process. Although, as I mentioned earlier, we've heard a lot in our process so far about the desire for aging in place and creating family-friendly and buildings and spaces, as well as spaces and buildings that are that can accommodate older adults. And so that is something that we're thinking about as we're thinking about our public spaces and how people get around in the neighborhood as well.
In terms of format and content of design discussions over the next month?
Sure. So in terms of format and content, as I mentioned, our 2 upcoming meetings are a kind of open house format. So we'll have a lot of boards, we'll have a lot of staff, all the faces here you'll see in person if you come to one of those events and more. And we'll have a lot of graphics of buildings and spaces along the corridor. And as Meryl was mentioning, some different development scenarios. And what we're really trying to get at there is a few different options of how development could occur in certain places to have a bit more of a dialogue and a back and forth and talk about some of the different trade-offs and pros and cons of some of those, so we can hear from you and your neighbors about what are sort of desirable characteristics about certain development scenarios and what are less desirable, so we can then incorporate those into our report in the winter. And as I mentioned before, it's open house format meetings, so it's about a 3-hour block of time. Folks can drop in at any point during that time and stay for a few minutes to have a short conversation, or they can stay longer. At the 2 events that we held on Connecticut Avenue over the last month, we found some people stayed for a long time, actually, and engaged with us on conversations, or just really looked at the information and took it all in. There are opportunities for folks to kind of leave sticky notes or put dots on things that they like, and also, as I mentioned, just engage with our staff and our consultants about talking about design, but also some of the process and how these things come to be as well.
And we also have kind of a follow-up question to that answer from Susan. If you can attend one of the in-person sessions, is there a way to contribute comments?
Yeah. After the 2 sessions, we'll be sharing an online version of the content that is shared on those boards on our project webpage, and we'll have the ability for folks to provide feedback kind of through an online survey format as well. Right now, actually, following the 2 meetings and events that we had on Connecticut Avenue, there's an online survey open that does just that for our Connecticut Avenue piece of this project as well. And so that's something we'll be doing on Wisconsin Avenue following our December 3rd meeting.
Great. The next question is from Robert. If the affordable housing goal of Rock Creek West is 2,000 units, then the housing goal generally might be about 10,000 units. Has this been visualized? What does that look like? What is the time frame that this represents?
Yeah, thanks, Robert, for that question. So visualizing what the development will look like is exactly part of our process. That's what we'll be doing at our upcoming community design conversations, seeing sort of the size of different buildings and where they would fit on this corridor. It's not expected that the Wisconsin Avenue corridor would necessarily completely meet our housing goal for Rock Creek West, but it's an important part of us meeting that housing goal. In terms of the time frame, you know, all development is, or most all development is private development, and so that's up to the market and both sort of local and global and national trends. And what we're doing is setting up the zoning and development land use regulations that would permit a certain kind of development that meets our policy goals, but it would take several years for that to materialize. And development also happens in cycles. Sometimes there's more and sometimes there's less at different times as well.
Please say more about the business needs assessment research that is underway with your team. What efforts will be made to develop long-lasting relationships with Black and Brown business organizations so that our ward can benefit from the growth of these businesses and they in turn can profit from a robust market?
It's a great question, Meg. So we're really starting from sort of space and looking at how much space is there today, whether it's empty or full. A lot of the business space is vacant along Wisconsin Avenue, some more in Friendship Heights than in Tenleytown. And so that's really where we're starting and trying to understand how much space is needed and where and what kind of space to accommodate and support more housing development and other kinds of changes on the corridor. But your question about Black and Brown businesses is a really important one and something that we're trying to think about, particularly in this part of the city where we see we might see fewer of those kinds of businesses compared to other parts of the city, and certainly working with our partner agencies in terms of programs that can help expand those opportunities to those businesses on Wisconsin Avenue and in Rock Creek West.
Next, we have a question from John and a similar question from Ronald. So I'm going to read them both together. What will be the end result? Do you expect to make recommendations to the DC Council to make changes in the comprehensive plan? And Ronald is asking, what are the implementation measures anticipated?
Sure. So the end result is of the study is a report with recommendations to make zoning changes. And zoning changes are not approved by the DC Council. They are approved by the Zoning Commission. And so the recommendations to make the zoning changes would be then made by the Office of Planning. We would take forward changes to the zoning along Wisconsin Avenue that would help achieve some of the goals in the comprehensive plan. And so that is the outcome of this process. And so that's sort of on the buildings and development side. In terms of public space and public realm, the end result would be to make recommendations around sort of where and what kinds of public spaces would be important to prioritize, both from the public and private sector, and also sort of what kinds of activities or programming would or should happen in those spaces after they're sort of built or created. And then also sort of on the business and commerce side, recommendations around some strategic actions that could be taken by the commercial management districts or by our partner district agencies to achieve the retail and commercial goals of this neighborhood in the future.
Comp plan states that planning for future planning analysis areas, quote, should evaluate current infrastructure and utility capacity against full build out and projected population and economic growth. The evaluation of current infrastructure and utility capacity should specify the physical or operational capacity both inside the boundaries and any relevant district-wide infrastructure available, end quote. Is OP doing this review?
Yeah, good question. So the future planning analysis area, so Wisconsin Avenue is one of the future planning analysis areas that were outlined on one of the maps in the comprehensive plan. And there are many across the city. Well, not many, but there are a few across the city. And so that's that analysis is part of a separate process that we'll be pursuing later next year that looks at the various future planning analysis areas, because a lot of our infrastructure isn't necessarily place specific. Networks like power or gas or sewer, often a change in one area could actually have an impact somewhere else, and it's part of sort of a broader system. And so that's why we'll be looking at those future planning analysis areas together. What this study will actually do, though, to help that process is to provide us with a sense of what that capacity actually will be or should be planned for in a more detailed way than the comprehensive plan does just with the maps itself. So the outputs of our study here can be useful inputs into that analysis moving forward. Again, the changes that will be happening along Wisconsin Avenue are sort of long-term changes, and it's helpful for us to be understanding the full capacity of that change, but we also recognize that it happens over years and decades.
WMATA bus garage. One is from Carol and one is from Margaret. The first is, if WMATA moves the bus garage, will they be required to clean up their current toxic site? And the second question is, if WMATA purchases Lord and Taylor, will it be allowed to develop it as a matter of right project, or will there be robust community participation in the planning of the redevelopment?
Sure. So I can't speak to the what kinds of environmental contamination may exist on WMATA's site. So I don't know what their requirements to clean that may be, but if there is contamination, I would expect they would be required to clean it, or if they vacated that site, then the subsequent developer or whoever that may be would be required to do that. But that is a question for WMATA, and I don't want to answer for them. Second part of that was, if WMATA purchases the Lord and Taylor, would they be allowed to develop as a matter of right project, or would there be robust community participation? So the answer, one does not preclude the other. WMATA would have to engage in a robust community process, regardless of what their development approval process might need to be with the district. So I think you should expect WMATA to have a pretty robust community process for their ongoing activities in Friendship Heights with the bus garage there.
We next have a question from Jamie. We know that we need more than IZ units to produce the amount of affordable housing that we want and need. Are there parcels of land you've identified that hold promise for more creative financing and design opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. On the financing side, we have a few tools. Some are sort of more newly created over the past few years that target this part of the city for incentives to produce more affordable housing, whether those are tax abatements or higher prioritization in the Housing Production Trust Fund. And so those aren't necessarily tied to particular parcels. They're usually tied to a project and the strength of like their application or what they're proposing to do. But, as I mentioned before, one of the things we're looking at, and this is again, not particular to any specific parcel, is how to incorporate higher levels of inclusionary zoning into into properties along this corridor as they are rezoned in the future, which is one of the reasons why we're exploring rezoning those properties ourselves to be able to incorporate those higher levels of inclusionary zoning upfront.
She says, it sounds like IZ is considered the principal way to get affordable housing, i.e. the more units built, then more affordable housing units there will be. Do you have a projection of how many new units or a range might result from building out the increased height and density along Wisconsin Avenue with IZ?
Yeah, so IZ is certainly one important way to produce more affordable housing, more dedicated affordable housing, particularly on the Wisconsin Avenue corridor. And it's the principal tool that the Office of Planning has. We're not an agency that deals with housing finance. We're an agency that deals with development capacity. And so that's the tool that is available to us and that we have the sort of most purview over. Part of this process will be to develop that projection. It will be a range based on the amount of development, the amount of building that we expect could occur here through this rezoning process. So that's where this process is heading, is to kind of narrow down on a projection for how many units and how many IZ units could be produced here based on that increase in height and density at various levels along the corridor.
Concerns about increased density and what that might bring to the corridor. These concerns include parking to accommodate new residents and guests and retail entertainment, concern that this will overflow into neighborhood. What ideas do we have? B, traffic will increase, especially the amount of traffic that will cut between Connecticut Avenue, Reno, and Wisconsin. What traffic studies will be done, if any, and when? I'm also concerned about Harrison Street, which is already a shortcut between Connecticut, Reno, and Wisconsin.
Sure. So as far as parking goes, we would expect any of new buildings to include their parking in underground garages. This is something that's incentivized through the district zoning code and is typically what happens when we have sort of new development or redevelopment. And the parking, the way that parking is required in new development is usually as a proportion of housing units and as a relationship to the kinds of retail or office that may exist in that building. And so it's all kind of formulated and set out in the zoning code. And but I should say there are reductions in how much parking is required of a new development. We have parking minimums, not maximums. And those reductions exist particularly on or near metro stations, which is where we're looking now. And so a big reason why we're concentrating our expectations for future growth along the Wisconsin Ave corridor and in this area is because to leverage the existing transit infrastructure that's there today on the Red Line, but also the bus lines that terminate at both Friendship Heights and Tenley Town. And as far as traffic, our colleagues at DDOT typically handle traffic-related studies and planning. And I should add actually that in addition to the projects I mentioned earlier that we're coordinating with them on, there are bike lanes proposed in Friendship Heights and also some traffic safety improvements along Wisconsin Avenue as part of the Vision Zero program that have been funded this fiscal year to improve walking and driving and biking along Wisconsin Avenue as well.
It says many of the new buildings are built right up to the sidewalks, removing and or not allowing any green space. How is this being addressed?
Sure, yeah. We typically encourage new buildings, particularly on our sort of busier corridors, to be built up to the property line, which is sort of where the sidewalk starts. And a lot of that is there's some design reasons for that, and to create a stronger social interface between the building and the sidewalk and the stores. In terms of how that's being addressed, our zoning includes something called lot occupancy, which means how much of a property a building can take up. And for most of our residential areas, there's always a proportion of the property that can't be built on. That space is sometimes used as green space or gardens or yards or things like that. But it's often not in the front, it's sometimes on the side or in the back. It can create a transition to the neighbors in the back. And typically on the front, we do like for the buildings to come up to the sidewalk, again, to create that sort of welcoming front door. But one of the things we're also looking at is, well, what happens on the sidewalk? And we have wide sidewalks on parts of Wisconsin Avenue, and thinking about how to incorporate more greenery into those spaces, particularly actually between the street and the sidewalk, is something that we're exploring and that we've heard a little bit about too as part of our public engagement, to bring more greenery to the corridor and also create a bit of a visual and sound buffer between the cars and people who are walking on the sidewalk or having a coffee outside in a cafe or something like that.
Great. The next question is from Elizabeth. Is DC talking with the federal government about opportunities on publicly owned land?
None that I'm aware of in this project area. Certainly there are conversations happening about transfers of federal land to the district in places like Poplar Point or RFK Stadium, former RFK Stadium, around the waterfront, but not along the Wisconsin Avenue corridor.
Great. Next question is from Carol. Is there any opportunity to propose that some of the development not go to the maximum level allowed by the FLUM changes and be zoned lower?
So certainly that could happen, but we are looking at maximizing the changes made to the future land use map in the comprehensive plan and understanding how much new housing capacity and affordable housing could be produced in doing so. As part of our development scenarios, what we're looking at is, again, understanding if we have less development, then what does that mean in terms of housing and affordable housing on the corridor, so that we can sort of see and visualize and understand what those trade-offs look like in this part of the city. And so certainly as part of our process at our meetings coming up, when we're showing different development scenarios, we'll be showing the expectation of how much housing is produced in those different scenarios, so that sort of everybody's on the same page as far as what a design decision means in terms of housing production and affordable housing production.
We think of the evening is from Ronald. The ULI TAP had some interesting ideas, particularly about creating new pedestrian connections in the neighborhood. Will the consultant team be able to address those ideas at the design conversation?
Yes. And if Meryl or Ron want to add anything to my one-word answer, please do.
I think that sums it up, but yeah, we are looking at several scenarios that consider additional pedestrian connections.
Great. I think that ends our Q&A portion for the evening. Thank you all so much for sticking around. I know we went a little bit past. We do have one more question. Erican, one more question.
Sure. Yeah. The question is, can Ward 3 meet its affordable housing goals with new construction alone, or will there be some way to convert existing housing into affordable? So the expectation for Rock Creek West for Ward 3 is that to meet the affordable housing goal, particularly by 2025, new construction alone wouldn't be able to accommodate that. Partly just because of the timeline of development actually happens pretty slowly, and so there are other ways that existing housing that is not necessarily dedicated, affordable, or income restricted today could be converted into dedicated affordable housing in the future. And so in the Rock Creek West roadmap that was outlined in that document, and it was one of the slides, I mentioned it from one of the slides earlier. So certainly that conversion is certainly one of the options given the existing housing stock that's there today.
Joining us this evening. We want to invite you, please join us for the community design conversations. Check out the information on the website. Be in touch. Let us know if there's other ways that we can engage with you all. But thank you for joining us this evening. And Eric, and I'll let you send us off with some final words.
Okay, well, yes, thanks. And thank you for thanking us in the Q&A also. And we look forward to seeing everybody out at our upcoming meetings. We had two really good meetings on Connecticut Avenue. We had a lot of positive feedback actually about the format and content of those meetings. So we're looking forward to sharing more with you all about Wisconsin Avenue and hearing from you all as well. So as was mentioned earlier, this presentation and video will be posted to the project webpage. So folks can take a look there as well if they weren't able to join tonight. Thank you. Good night.